Yes. Okay. Let's get up my notes here. Great, wonderful. Kia ora koutou. As Greg said, my name is Vanessa Gerrie, and I'm really happy to be here for the first time in a long time in person at a conference. It's really exciting to meet all of you, and I feel a little bit nervous even because of that very fact. But here we go. So this research, unlike Malcolm's, this is definitely at the very beginning for me. I'm using some of the work that I developed in my doctoral thesis and kind of using that as a lens to look at a whole bunch of new things in this digital space as it relates to fashion. So I'll jump right in. As a global society, we continue to traverse the space between the analog and the digital, trying to make sense of the metaverse and the Internet of Things, as these terms continue to dominate our contemporary lexicon and new kind of terms enter the lexicon. And so this paper, like I said before, is the beginning of a research project, and will begin to critically investigate the ways in which creative fashion practitioners are utilizing digital technologies quite broadly for the production and communication of their ideas on both a commercial level and also a creative conceptual one. The scholar Maria Luisa Freezer states, and I quote here, "Fashion is the most incredible platform to understand the arts of our century. Fashion is a place where everything collapses," end quote. The rapid dominance of information and communication technology devices over the past 2 decades has really shifted the way that humans interact, like Malcolm articulated really nicely before. Therefore, it's no surprise that fashion, as I guess a vessel of culture, as I like to describe it, has really changed its form in tandem with these evolutions. It's often quite at the forefront of these types of developments. So using the conceptual framework developed in my doctoral thesis, I'll map case studies against the theoretical framework of metamodernism. I'm thinking about the ways in which fashion practitioners are now using digital technologies to not only construct garments, but to communicate movement and build digital worlds and global digital communities as well. So this will develop with a particular focus on augmented reality or AR and virtual reality, VR. Thinking about how fashion practitioners have adopted these technologies to really expand their creative practices and change their relationship with the audiences too. Oh, I see. Cool. So if this digital space is where contemporary global populations commune and construct meaning, like Malcolm mentioned before too, then the questions that are kind of guiding this research in a really broad sense are as follows. What ethical impacts do digital technologies have on the culture of fashion? And how can digital world building lead to a more sustainable fashionscape, as we like to call it? And if so, how? So the British fashion photographer, scholar and professor Nick Knight recently stated that, and I quote here, "The digital world is a society, it's a civilization." And I really love this quote and kind of want to keep it in mind as we start to interrogate the ways that the digital may affect the way in which we commune together and socialize as a global community. So over the past couple of years, especially after the pandemic, we've lived our lives so much more online to an extent that we've created so many new conventions and social constructs across kind of language, semiotics, language and images that influence the way in which people, I'd say, collectivize and make meaning together. So this has really impacted not only technological development, but also things like activist movements, political movements, as we've seen, and the ways in which we consume creative media for joy and pleasure. So the boundaries between our physical selves and the digital has really blurred and collapsed even further. And the internet and the Internet of Things allows us to build the digital world into a society, into a civilization, as Nick Knight mentions. And so this is really the context in which I'm talking about these terms. So for my doctoral research, I developed a conceptual methodology to map contemporary fashion practices that I called borderless fashion. And as a proposition, fashion really is what we call a modernist project that incorporates aspects of the postmodern condition. So my research really proposes that fashion in the 21st century has evolved into a meta-modern practice. And there are definitely a lot of other kind of propositions for what this next era can be called. Some of them include digimodern, metamodernism, ultramodernism, hyperreality, etc. But metamodernism is the one I've kind of chosen to use as my theoretical framework for my research, just because I think it really articulates the kind of spirit of the times. So metamodern aesthetics incorporates collaboration, interdisciplinarity, an opening up of perspectives and identities, and a breaking down of binaries across a lot of different things, that including the physical and the digital. And this is why I think it's a really interesting, I guess, paradigm description or nomenclature for the current digital world and the lives we conduct within and between them, especially in relation to fashion being a space in which we see this collapsing of terrain between the physical and digital. So we can see this almost neo-romantic or even neo-utopic sensibility being applied to the world building of digital metaverses. As we see our physical bodies and our experience blur or even kind of transcend into the digital, or at least work together in this kind of symbiotic way. So creative digital practices are also incredibly interdisciplinary, as I mentioned before, as there is, of course, a reliance on multiple skills from multiple fields to build such worlds and garments. 3D modelers, writers, kind of, more humanities theorists, but then also all of the kind of technical labor that needs to go into it as well. So there's this real kind of fostering of collaboration, I think we see in this space across a lot of different fields, which is really exciting. And I think it's really necessary, especially in the context of the fashion industry, to kind of rebuild what a lot of people would call a broken system. So the name metamodern also just fits with the current zeitgeist, I think, as I said before, especially regarding digital social spaces. So just for a little bit of etymology, the prefix meta is derived from the Greek metaxis, which was used to describe the condition of in-betweenness. It's definitely how we use it today. And it is referred to initially, or at least in kind of early texts in Plato's Symposium, where metaxia is defined through representation of the character Diotima as the in-between or kind of middle ground, or even mediator between the gods and mankind. So metaxis is described as the dynamic space between two separate things, where mediation keeps the universe together. So meta therefore refers to that which is with, between, or beyond, which I think is a really interesting kind of a history or etymology for the digital metaverse in all of its sociocultural manifestations. So the Internet of Things, which I'm sure is a kind of collection of words some of you may have heard of or even use. It's not just an awkward yet kind of charming phrase, but a set of words used to describe groups of objects, things, or devices that through software and are connected to digital networks. And the term was first discussed, which could be contested, like a lot of these social constructs kind of are, as a concept by telecommunications specialist Peter T. Lewis in 1985 to discuss the connectivity through devices that can enable communication, surveillance, and evaluation. So our smartphones being the #1 dominant example of these objects, but also kind of computerized cars, personal computers, watches, even household lighting, and maybe even in the future kind of more wearable tech and even clothing. So these things, as Mercedes-Benz and Graham Michael state, and I quote here, have become media able to both generate and communicate information. So the term is a bit of a misnomer, coined before the internet really reached its dominance and I guess the socio-cultural landscape. And the lexicon constructed around the internet and its technologies and devices really developed before we as a global society really had a grasp on its functions, its scope, its impact. So things we are arguably, still yet to fully understand in all of their complexities. So it's still a little bit messy. There's still a lot of these kind of awkward terms and awkward kind of representations that are put out. But the fact is we have become more entangled and reliant on the interconnectedness of the Internet of Things in our daily lives, not just for general functioning, but actually how we socially interact and commune, like Malcolm was mentioning before. So this shift in reliance was put into further relief, obviously with the pandemic, but there are many benefits that the fashion industry have begun to use on both a conceptually creative level, like I mentioned before, as well as a practical one. There's a lot of kind of wearable tech, as I mentioned, a lot of beautiful research in that space. Nike recently did an adapt shoe that can lace themselves electronically to adjust to the shape of your foot through, I think, kind of custom motorized sensors. And they also have LED lights on them to represent different fits, which is really cool. Apologies, I don't have an image of them here. There's also, different fitness gear that can track your health and your performance capabilities. There's even a prototype bra that aims to alert people of early signs of breast cancer. So the work that is being done in that particular space in terms of wearable tech is vast and experimental, with varying levels of impact in society yet. But there's certainly a lot of amazing research being done. So the creative fashion industry, I guess, as a cultural field, has really picked up on digital technologies over the past couple of years to essentially re-establish a broken cultural industry that has become essentially damaging to the environment, right? I think we can all probably say that. To the people who work across the supply chain, and to more and more consumers and fashion insiders, this is becoming, I guess, fatiguing and frustrating. And I guess, seeing the sheer volume of product and the homogenous representations that are communicated through the dominant fashion industry, there are kind of groups of people who are really experimenting in this space to create impactful change. So the creation of metaverses has been seen as part of a wider kind of solution to some of these problems or concerns. And as Malcolm mentioned too, this idea of the metaverse is really describes a fully realized digital world that exists beyond the physical, or at least in symbiosis with it, perhaps is a nice way of talking about it. And the word itself is a blend of multiple terms, that being meta, the in-between, and universe. And the term was not in fact coined by Mark Zuckerberg, like I'm sure a lot of kind of young generations may think, but actually in sci-fi novels by Neil Stephenson, one from 1992 called Snow Crash, and then further explored in Ready Player One by Ernest Cline. What year was that? Does anyone know? I saw you nodding. I can't remember. Last decade, exactly, maybe even 2011 or something like that. Yeah, which engaged with this concept of immersive virtual realities and global social connection. So the first kind of, I guess, in the context that I'm thinking of, and with fashion and how they draw on kind of gaming technologies, they're really drawing on those early developments in metaverses and game tech. At the turn of the millennium, and within the 90s as well. So the immersion kind of into these virtual worlds is of course assisted by the use of virtual reality headsets, etc. And many different corners of the internet have metaverse elements. Social media utilizes immersive tactics created to express identities in persons. We see that with augmented reality. And we can see the utilization of NFTs, or non-fungible tokens, to sell creative work, and cryptocurrency and Web3 spaces. Also sees an engagement with this metaversal experience. So the growing uptake of engagement with metaverses or virtual realities in these contexts also evolves alongside kind of more ethical concerns that need to be, I guess, critically reflected on as we keep evolving. And David Chambers in Reality Plus states that, and I quote here, you've got your psychological identity, how you feel inside, and then your social identity, how you express that in the VR world. That's just more complex. So it's really nice to, I guess, start to see, like I said, these critical discourses around the expression of identity in these digital worlds, and what the longer term implications or benefits are of this stuff. So fashion as a culture industry really acts as a mirror of the times that can manifest in positive, but also quite sinister ways. Within the fashion industry, there is really a reckoning with regard to the production and supply chain, things like representations and cultural appropriation, the overall effects of the industry on climate change. But fashion can also play a hand at advancing and giving platform to technological developments in a digestible manner. Everyone engages with fashion on some level. It's functional. It also serves as creative experimentation across aesthetics and technology. And the rapidly changing nature of our physical world, pandemics, extreme weather, etc., and the complete lack of kind of effective change that we're seeing not enacted by our governments and monolithic corporate conglomerates on these things means that we are living our lives more and more in the digital, as predicted by many science fiction writers of the 20th century. And this stark shift, I guess, in the wider global context means that for fashion, less production needs to occur, more circular economies established, and potentially a more utilitarian sense of dress that really reflects the physical environment we find ourselves living in. So fashion in the creative sense can be expressed in the digital realm, as articulated here by Michelle LaRosse of digital fashion company, The Fabricant. And The Fabricant are one of the first companies to kind of really spearhead digital clothing design and the 3D modeling of such for purchase and use across social media, across different metaverses. And she states here, from the fabricant's perspective, we're building our business for a future where physical fashion becomes utilitarian in response to our planetary circumstances and the need to preserve natural resources. But the digital environment is where we will let our fashion imaginations run wild. In a non-physical world where all things are possible, we can boldly express ourselves without limitations or boundaries. So what does digital fashion kind of look like? Often contemporary consumers of fashion buy physical garments exclusively to be worn for social media as an exercise in building cultural capital. These are some examples here. From the Fabricant. This is their digital fashion marketplace, so you can kind of go in and actually purchase 3D physical or digital garments rather. So like any civilization, the digital one will in time kind of construct and inscribe meaning to adornment. But for now, iterative developments and experimentations dominate the terrain with, I guess, varying levels of success. Here we can see an example of a Snapchat by the Milan-based company Prada, which is a label I'm sure everyone's familiar with. It's kind of permeated across culture, and with AR filters. So a lot of people who might not be able to actually access a Prada bag can actually go on and use this kind of augmented reality to try it on, to kind of perform the brand through social media. So that's kind of where we're seeing maybe the most impactful use of digital technologies used in a really commercial way. And so, yeah, there are those practitioners too who are building virtual realities and those that are augmenting our own physical experience, like I said before. And some are more commercial and can be leveraged to democratize fashion, as Prada's done here, and make it more accessible in terms of consumption, so that the masses can experience a fashion show through AR technology, as long as they have a smartphone connected to other smartphones and other Internet of Things. Or other things in the internet, however we want to describe it. And some are more conceptually experimental. As you can see on the right-hand side there, that is also a digital garment that is a lot more conceptual and experimental. It's called biomimicry, and it's a bodysuit by another digital fashion company, Ouroboros, who do these really beautiful kind of commissions for brands to, I guess, express the brand identity. So that's often where we see a lot of the more creative, experimental side of digital fashion taking place. Yeah, so digital fashion across both design and communication presents opportunities to create meaningful communities. It can subvert or dismantle fashion industry norms as well, in terms of representation, and to establish a more kind of sustainable production system through quite literally producing less physical garments. And obviously, you know, the other side of that, the production of kind of more digital means that there are other kind of impacts on the environment through kind of server farms, etc. But that's part of, you know, the whole kind of ecosystem of critically reflecting about this stuff. But the digital generations, you know, those that have been brought up, or at least in part, immersed in digital technology as a normalized function of everyday life, will really be the ones these technologies are developed for and by, and they hold a different experience of the world and potentially a different set of values and ethical concerns than older generations. And we call these people digi-sapiens, or at least that's what Vogue Business kind of articulated. And they state that digi-sapiens are, I quote, a person who has grown up in the digital era, is comfortable blurring reality and fantasy, and is an early adopter of technology like AR and digital fashion. So brands are really creating, I guess, literal digital garments to be worn, mediated through our devices. And the Fabricant, as mentioned before, is one of these companies who uses 3D modeling and gaming tech to create digital garments. And alongside other more experimental ones, as mentioned before, Ouroboros, and another one called the Institute of Digital Fashion, who are really pushing and advocating for the adoption of digital tech as a way of dismantling kind of harmful practices in the fashion industry. Already established fashion brands are picking up on these kind of trends in the digital tech arena as well, as you saw before. Prada is, and this is an example by Gucci from 2021, where they created a Gucci Garden, which was an online kind of exhibition space, almost like, I feel like Walter Benjamin would have a real field day with this. People could kind of go on and promenade and go into these different stores and spaces to experience, I guess, the whole kind of Gucci world as avatars. So this image represents a still from the Gucci Garden Metaverse installation gallery that they produced. And like I said before, users could move through a space as an avatar, experiencing a curated fantasy world, which once again is something that a lot of people usually wouldn't have access to. Not everyone can go to a Gucci fashion show, but these big brands you see kind of democratizing that experience for the consumers, where they don't actually have to buy a garment, but they can experience the world through these metaverses that they create, which I think is a really interesting development. And the virtual exhibition guided visitors through 7 rooms themed around Gucci's past fashion collections, interacting with digitally constructed natural elements and immersive exhibition space. So when visitors enter the virtual space, they shed the avatars and become a neutral mannequin, which then takes on elements of its surroundings as users navigate the exhibition. So there's this really nice symbiosis between kind of architectural spaces and the natural world, and this kind of combining of the two, which is something that would be a lot, I guess, more difficult to do in real physical, in the real physical world as well. So this world building really supports large companies, I think, like Gucci, like Prada, to reach a wider audience. And they also obviously have the cash to kind of put a lot of money into building these metaverses as well, which is an important thing to kind of mention. And these digital metaverses are slowly starting to emerge, I guess, with our physical worlds, as people get more and more comfortable engaging with them as well and navigating those spaces based on their own kind of access and their own literacies around these digital worlds. So particularly after 2020, the dominant way in which we live our lives is in the digital metaverse, or at least across social media and in gaming communities, etc. And this is how we socially commune, as I mentioned before, and as Malcolm mentioned. Therefore, it only makes sense that to dress up our digital selves starts to blur or break down this divide between the physical and digital even more. As mentioned previously, fashion is an expression of the contemporary zeitgeist, which includes the dominant discourses of any given time as well. So for 2022, these discourses include a kind of critical focus on ethics and social justice, the subversion of toxic fashion norms that we've seen perpetuated by the industry for decades. And we see these really beginning to be challenged in the digital space in a much more meaningful way than what we see on the fashion catwalks. Intersectional representation is a dominant value that subverts these norms, especially with a company like the Institute of Digital Fashion. They do a lot of collaborations with fashion influencers who have different disabilities, who are neurodiverse. So we see this really beautiful representation and perspective from other consumers and users of fashion that really haven't had a voice before. So some fashion critics mapping the rise of digital technologies in the fashion industry worry that there may be a fracturing of self within the digital representation sphere. Others may see that as a really good thing, but the lead fashion critic of the New York Times, Vanessa Friedman, stated here, as we start to spend more and more time online, in which case juggling a multiplicity of selves and styles may start to feel less liberating and confusing, and the line between freedom of self-expression and disguise is hard to pass. I don't know if I agree with her. I think this is maybe someone who hasn't lived online too much, and it's more of someone feeling a bit ostracized from the space. But I thought it was just kind of important to maybe put a quote in here from, I guess, the dissenting fashion voices of the old guard and what they're having to say in this. But yes, not sure I really agree with what she's saying there fully myself. And, you know, with any new technology, there needs to be a critical reflection and discourse in this back and forth around, I guess, the ethics of it and the use of AR and VR, you know, could often be said to perpetuate certain damaging beauty standards as we see digitally enhanced representations of ourselves, especially, I guess, with the introduction of Snapchat and the use of that over the past few years. However, equally, such standards perpetuated by the current fashion system are yet to be fully deconstructed. So the digital space may be the sphere to really challenge them as more perspectives get to have a platform, a voice, and agency due to the really democratizing nature of the digital sphere as it's shared through communication technologies. So at this point, for the average audience or consumer, you know, the question is, are these developments any more immersive maybe than a film viewed on the screen? You know, because we're really trained in moving images created by Hollywood cinematic machines, or through engagement with video game worlds in which role play is exercised as an extension of self, or even as a separate identity, these digital representations are still associated with fantasies to some level, you could say. So this creates an almost free-for-all in terms of aesthetic decisions being made by users, as this demarcation between the physical and the digital tend to still represent a binary of real and fake from some perspectives. However, digital fashion may get to the essence of what fashion is about, you know, the creative expression of identity as an individual and as a community as well. I know we're running out of time, so I'll just speed through these last couple of slides I have. This is an example of another kind of digital platform really experimenting in this space. This is Icon One, which was a platform established this year by Nick Knight, whose quote I used at the very start of this presentation. And his digital platform Show Studio has been really advanced and kind of pushing technological experimentation since the year 2000, collaborating with 3D modelers and fashion film directors since then. But he wanted to create a digital community that links fashion designers, stylists, and digital artists together to create digital meta worlds and metaverses. And Knight and his community of, I guess, these really diverse avant-garde creative practitioners are developing an inclusive and dynamic metaverse that really acts as a challenge to the damaging norms in the industry. It connects young creative practitioners. It connects these diverse voices together. And this is one example of the, I'll go back, of, oh, you saw it playing before, but that was a collaboration with an artist, Giselle Zanotti, in which they created 8,000 one-of-a-kind avatars together, as we saw before. So their ambitions to become a digital metaverse where creative folks from across the globe collect together, share work, ideas, and to generally collaborate. So other fashion brands have extended their reach into video game story worlds as well, dressing characters and designer clothes, which is a seemingly obvious utilization of new advertising space, you could say. I know Gucci collaborated with Sims 4, as well as a kind of list of other designers such as Thierry Mugler and Telfa dress their avatars in Sims, which is quite a cool development on more of a kind of fashion level. But Balenciaga, after all, The Age of Tomorrow was a game created to, I guess, represent and communicate Balenciaga's Fall Winter 2021 collection. And the game really represents an elaborate metaverse with multiple landscapes, including city streets, forests, ancient ruins, a rocky cave, and mountains. And the gameplay is predetermined, and the user audience follows glowing arrows that guide through different terrains to create an overall story. So as the user or viewer follows the arrows, they pass avatars dressed in a montage of collection, garments, as well as a more fantastical costumes, such as suits of armor, which would probably only exist in the digital space. They won't actually be produced in physical form. And the gameplay is now available to watch as a film online. You can find it on YouTube. However, on release, a select few were invited to play with actual VR headsets, an alternative to attending a live runway show. And a really interesting function of this one was that halfway through the gameplay, they actually had a blank screen with a pulsating circle in the center to appear, where credits would usually be shown with the words breathe and hold printed across the circle to really encourage the player to participate in meditation style breathing exercises, which I thought was really cool. And I guess shows this consciousness around some of these ethical concerns that traverse the space between the physical and digital, especially with regard to kind of breaking that symbiosis just for a little bit of time. This showed a little video, but I might skip that just for time's sake. So practitioners who are working in this space really see it as an opportunity to reconstruct a broken industry. And the Institute of Digital Fashion, who I mentioned before, are world leaders in the field, and in their manifesto, which is pictured here, which you can't see the full details of, they state that the impact that the utilization of digital tech into creative fashion practices could have a huge impact across things like representation, inclusivity for people underrepresented in the industry. And they state in the last lines of the manifesto that the Institute of Digital Fashion asks you to reimagine a space where marginalized voices can be heard and given platform to, where they are represented fairly. So the Institute collaborates with multiple brands, such as more commercial companies like H&M and also Show Studio, to develop digital solutions for some of the big ethical issues that plague the fashion industry. So I wanted to end on this quote too, that fashion can be looked at anthropologically, sociologically, and even philosophically. It's an expression of individual and collective desire. It is a barometer of change. It involves issues of identity and sexuality. It engages with and even stimulates technology, science, and business, just to name a few of the elements that are a part of fashion. And so with the development of multiple metaverses and adaptable technologies, fashion can be seen as a powerful field in which meaningful developments are being made. So the utopian future of the development of VR and AR fashion, facilitated by the Internet of Things, is that it will further transcend the boundary between the physical and digital realms. And LaRosse goes on to state that AR filters used on social media now to adorn and distort our faces potentially could evolve to encapsulate the whole body with full motion of the chosen garment, which is more of the symbiosis of the physical and digital, supported by sensitive digital technologies. So, that's where we might see people with disabilities, will be able to engage meaningfully with this, as well as people across kind of disparate global communities as well. She goes on to state that others will be able to see your digital fashion identity when walking down the street, and the data shared through digitally connected devices will be this kind of extension and evolution of the Internet of Things. So that's the last slide. That was a billboard made by the Institute of Digital Fashion, which kind of sums up their whole impetus, I guess. But that's me. Thank you so much for listening.